Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is Nietzsche Cringe or Based. I listened to a series of lectures all about Nietzsche's life and Nietzsche's work. I plan to cover Nietzsche's work individually, so this is more just overall. I plan to get to Thus Spoke Zarathustra after this, or maybe go and look into Arthur Schopenhauer, since Nietzsche takes some inspiration from him. So yeah, enjoy. This one's kind of a long one, sorry. The first thing that Nietzsche says is, what does the philosopher say about the philosophy, and the other way around? A lot of people misunderstand philosophy as something that's passed down, from other people. But usually, when you adopt philosophy, it says a lot about yourself and what you see in the world. Nietzsche wrote from 1882 to 1888 and spent the last 10 of his years life insane. Nietzsche went to the military at some point. He was raised in a Lutheran house. His father died when he was 4 and he was a pastor. Nietzsche spends his life as a Switzerland native after college. Not native, but you know what I mean. Nietzsche was mostly alone. Nietzsche's sister married a fascist, and he hated that. In fact, he tried to cut off ties with her. This is a very interesting line because a lot of people think that Nietzsche is like a fascist or something, but it's clear from the history that Nietzsche isn't. Nietzsche loved history and really liked Arthur Schopenhauer. Again, we'll get to why that's important later on. Will to Power was notes from Nietzsche, but was edited by his sister. So one of my favorite stories about Nietzsche was that he was taken to a brothel, right? That's basically like a prostitute house. And guess what this man did? This man found a piano and started playing it, and that's all he did. What a Chad, Sigma male style. Oh my god. He hated the leaders of the church rather than the church itself. Clearly, you can see this over time as he pointed very positively to Jesus, but overall the people leading the religion felt like it was just a mob mentality. Not mob mentality per se, but herd morality. Now, again, going back to this, Nietzsche really wasn't a Nazi. I know a lot of people think that because he was German and this was before World War I or II, and a lot of people see his will to power and beyond good and evil and the master and slave idea, and they think that Nietzsche was a Nazi. But in reality, Nietzsche really wasn't political at all. He barely touched upon those subjects, which unlike the Stoics touched upon what they ought to see society and how they wanted to rule it, but Nietzsche really wasn't political. And yet again, the idea of the Superman or the Übermensch is something not connected to white power. A lot of people think that it is, but it's clearly not. It's supposed to represent the best version of you. Now, one of my favorite lines was that Nietzsche called Socrates ugly. It's probably my favorite line. It sounds like a witty banter. It's something Dante would say, but he was, in a way, trying to compliment him. What he was basically doing is saying, even if you're ugly and you made such an influence on literature and life and philosophy, then that must be saying something. Now, Nietzsche wants to do something different with morality. Others in his field try to explain morality in a way to try and justify it. They feel like their morality is the right morality. But to Nietzsche, he just wanted to explain it in the most physical term possible. He thought morality really isn't about what makes somebody happy. A lot of people assume that once you reach a virtuous good that all of a sudden that you're happy, but that's not necessarily true. Even if you live your life to morality, you're still going to have issues within your life. Now, a quote from Nietzsche says, "Man does not seek happiness, the Englishman does." So this is clearly a diss to Kant. Kant is basically trying to justify all forms of morality and say that there is an objective form of reality. So he's clearly trying to diss Kant. We may go over Kant at a certain point, but Kant was really hard focused on Christianity and justifying morality. Even though let's face it, morality really isn't something that you can objectify. And just like I said, Nietzsche doesn't want to justify his morality, but rather just explain it. Nietzsche thought morality was a bit of a herd mentality. This is something that goes back to over and over again. It's something just not good or evil in the way that we think, but rather who do we follow, and the people that we are following, and the group around us, and the idea of the collectivism. In reality, what morality was just a fear of being alone. If morality is calculated by the herd mentality, then trying to come up with morality yourself, you'll end up feeling alone. One of the things that he said was, love is selfish. Kind of agree. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche wanted to change was truth. The idea of truth, especially back in the 1800s, was that it was just simply God. A lot of people pointed to God as the truth. They didn't even try to explain it. They just said truth was God and that's it. And just in general, there's a lack of myth with God. Now, to say that we created God is putting it lightly. We definitely did create this sort of thing. But anything negative that happens to humans is not God, but all the positives are. This is kind of the flawed nature that Nietzsche saw through. Now, one of the things that Nietzsche wanted to address is the 7 deadly sins. They're really okay as long as you don't go too far. Like, honestly, are these really sins? Like pride? If you're too prideful, does that make you evil? If you're sloth and a bit lazy, does that make you evil? And greed. It's okay to be greedy, honestly. Just not to the point where it consumes you. So these things aren't bad on their own. And of course, just like the Stoics, nature is innocent. Nietzsche always liked Homer for the tragedies, that the idea that pain just can't be explained. Socrates was always fighting with others, so the Greeks logically did the same thing. Socrates saw life to be overcome and to live in a better world instead of seeing life as what it is. For some reason, the Stoics kept this idea in their heads that we should move on to this better life, or we will return to a state of being after this life, but they don't respect the life the way that it is. They keep focusing on what's after that. Aristotle and Nietzsche could be similar. Now, not in everything, but mostly on God. You've probably seen the classic picture of the Stoics. Socrates is pointing up. It's either Socrates or Plato, okay? And Aristotle is pointing down. It's mostly coming towards talking about God. Aristotle didn't like God in the same way Nietzsche did. Now let's factor in what Schopenhauer believes. Schopenhauer sees life as a born, reproduce, and die. That there is no inherent meaning in life. This is obviously the doomer response and quite a nihilistic view for somebody to hold, but that's one of the reasons that Schopenhauer gained popularity. Schopenhauer takes a lot from Eastern ideas. But the difference is that Nietzsche is more lighthearted take on Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is seen as meaningless, constantly thinking that our lives have no inherent meaning. But Nietzsche goes a step forward and says that it does, that you can actually do things, like the passions. Now, the next thing to talk about is Zarathustra. Oh boy, I can't wait till we get to that part. Superman is the meaning of life and risk-taking. Superman is to go past humans. The last man is the opposite of the Superman. So basically what this means is that Nietzsche came up with the idea of the last man and the Superman. The Superman is everything good and life-risking and taking. It's the epitome of the person that you want to be. And the last man, the man that simply follows the herd and is lazy and doesn't apply himself. Zarathustra really wasn't understood by the humans. Zarathustra has created the ideas of good and evil and truth in that time. So Nietzsche uses him to show the monster that he's created, the world that has been led because of this idea of truth and good and evil that he created instead of doing other forms of morality. The world was mostly into reason, but Nietzsche was more so focused on the passions, and he even says multiple times that the passions kind of give life meaning. We are no different than animals in a way because we follow our instinct, not our reason. If people did this, there would be far fewer wars. The human spirit is also something that he talks about too. It's basically the idea of reason and passion. Now, there's also a famous quote that comes out of Nietzsche, is the "what kills you makes you stronger." This can mean exactly what it thinks, but it can also mean the opposite. Look, it really ends up on the person. Basically, in the story, in the context of the story, he was either mocking this idea or using this idea to push forward what it should be. There is no truth there, only interpretations. He was very close to this idea of reasoning. Nietzsche thinks his writing is art. He very much stuck to the idea of the passions, as we've been over time and again, but art was inherently connected to the passions, so of course he sees his writing as passions and many others as well. And the fact that science is always changing kind of changes your beliefs as well. Why is truth so important? The cost of truth is great. The truth will lead us to freedom. That's an idea that has been stuck around many times, but in reality, there really is no truth. And it's just based off of interpretations. The truth is appearances and interpretations. We see ourselves trying to find truth. But truth isn't something objective entirely. It's just based off of multiple different perspectives. Nietzsche said, let's get rid of the real world. And with the real world, the apparent world is gone too. Even if there was a God, you'd still see a world through a perspective. This is obviously another diss at Kant. Kant basically believing that truth and everything objective was all by God's design, so therefore God is ultimately objective, blah, blah, blah. But even then, you have to see things through a perspective. Now, Nietzsche presses on an idea that I think is in particular very interesting. Nietzsche talks about the freedom of limits, basically. Creativity comes from its best when it's controlled. The obvious one that I want to take an example is Hellblade. It's a game that I love and I think is ultimately a masterpiece, right? But that game was only worked by 20 people, right? It was very limited in scope and budget, only requiring one person to mocap and using the rest for live action. It was a super interesting endeavor, and because of the limits that they had, they ended up creating something special. So there is a freedom of limits of sorts, so Nietzsche was definitely right on this part. The self is something that can be broken down into science. It's something that's in all of us in some way, something that we can control from perspective. There is a destiny that you must take a responsibility for. And the next thing he wants to say is virtue doesn't necessarily mean that we're happy. This is something that I mentioned before, but just because you're on the most virtuous path doesn't mean that it's a happy one. Doing what you want versus doing what's right can be the same thing. Kierkegaard came up with the idea that it was a constant struggle between ethics and the pleasure. But in reality, sometimes these two things do overlap. Now, I don't want to go to Akumura's palace in Persona 5, but if I get past it, I get all to the good stuff. Another thing that Nietzsche points out is selfishness, just like love, is pity. Pity is a form of selfishness. We see somebody else's circumstance and we pity them, right? Hence why we say, I pity you. But that's just an ultimate form of selfishness and a sign of ego. Pity is a weak shadow of pain. Now, this is something that Nietzsche pointed out, is the fact that Christians created guilt. Basically, I understand this quote. I don't 100% agree with it, but I get where it's coming from. Oh, one of the things that Nietzsche pointed out is that forgetting is a virtue. A lot of times we like to think that, even I, honestly, wish I could remember everything that I've read or listened to or seen. You know, I wish I could remember those things for the test of time. But honestly, it's probably much better that I forget. Because sometimes you can forget certain traumas, sometimes you can forget certain people that didn't prove any value to you, or certain experiences. And honestly, forgetting something like in art and going back to it can really help you reinvigorate, that idea of something in the art form or something that you really enjoy. Nietzsche very much rejects the idea that when you're loving someone, you become one. Like, the idea in marriage is like, oh yes, when you marry, you all become one, you share the last name, but Nietzsche rejects this. It's basically the fact that, let's face it, even if you are married, you are still very, very separate people. You're separate people with different ideas. Sometimes friends just use each other instead of being just friends. In fact, often you find out that being friends with certain people is just an act of selfishness. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with it as long as it can be controlled. You know, it's a lot like faith in Christianity. Oh boy, Nietzsche really doesn't like that. But in all honesty, friendship is mutually inspired. Nietzsche compares truth as a woman. Now, hold on. Wait for it, okay? He hasn't talked about truth in a very good light, and now he's comparing it to women. Some people think it's sexist. But he's not doing this out of sexism, but rather putting a play on words in German. Because in German, where this, it's the original language from, truth is feminine. So there we go. We solved that, alright? Another one of the things that Nietzsche was trying to point out and bring life to is that feminism would only follow the same problems men have. So if we go through all these situations and females finally have equal rights, equal play, equal everything, they'll just fall into the same trap that men have. The point of the whip is that your idea of love is to be forced or used to others. Don't think of love in the same way. Nietzsche saw Socrates as a great rival. He saw him as not only things that he can poke holes in, but also respected him as a person. He respected him in his teachings as well. And it seemed like he admired the guy. But Nietzsche didn't like Plato either, so take of that what you will. Nietzsche tried to trace things back through history, much like Hegel. Hegel is another philosopher that tracked things through history as well, but they didn't really know each other, so the similarities kind of fall into deaf ears. And the last thing is that Nietzsche Hegel and the drawing seen by humans in the world is changing. Nietzsche disagreed with the idea that only the strongest survive, but rather the passions, like art. Like again, passions are a very key part of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche doesn't always choose the best. The other idea is the last man versus the Superman. Who would win? But to be honest, Nietzsche always thought that the last man would win, sadly. That we would eventually be taken over. But hopefully that future doesn't await. And don't think about your history, because it has destroyed you if you let it consume you. Okay, so yet again, is Nietzsche a nihilist? The answer is no, and I will explain for 2 reasons. One, he went through multiple definitions of certain points in time, so the rejection of traditions, what it was originally meaning. So exactly, it's not the same as it was years ago. And 2, Nietzsche thought life had meaning, which goes against nihilism. Nihilism thinks that there is no meaning, but Nietzsche clearly thinks about the passions. Things like fasting and control of oneself can look down upon others and feel a sense of control of others. Like, I can control this and they can't. You know, I've seen that a lot, especially when I met people that do drugs. I kind of see them as, and I would never do that, so I see them as above them. That's not necessarily the right way we should be taking. We are becoming more and more worldly with phones, movies, TV shows, and games. Now, obviously, he doesn't call out phones, movies, TVs, and games because, they didn't exist back then. But basically what he's trying to say is that we're always looking for an escapism from our real world, not really enjoying the life itself. There are 2 types of morality and morality. Okay, that doesn't help considering that there isn't text. But morality with a little m is the basic sense of right and wrong to a person. The capital M of morality is the objective sense. Nietzsche wants to go against the big M rather than the small m. Him thought morality is like colors. The apple is red rather than my brain tells me it's red. So there are certain perceptions that our brain comes up with. They think that that's red, but it's not red in the objective sense. You're just seeing it through your eyes. Morality is often just in us, and let's face it, morality is just within us. It's not something that the objective sense we can justify. It's not. We don't give medals to those who don't murder people. It's mostly to stop us from doing other things. Kant's morality isn't something that God is given, but rather differs from person to person. The immoralist and the antichrist stuff is basically clickbait. Nietzsche really didn't like the 10 Commandments, not because of the idea itself, but rather the execution. Kant's idea about morals were wrong. Guys, he's dissing Kant again. Let's go. His morals are about not doing anything wrong, so they're not really being a good person. At the end of the day, you'll just find that your life is just hollow. So what, you've achieved being a good person or doing no wrong things. How does that fill the void? And to be honest, Kant can't even fit Jesus with was a good person, because Kant's moral philosophy is all about not doing things, when Jesus was about helping others. The slave morality and the master morality came from history. Slaves isn't really challenging. They don't challenge the people that they're up against, and in many ways, slaves came from the idea of people being enslaved, and therefore it came up with basically religion. The master is a noble but refined type of morality. Makes society more excellent, doing what you want in a good way, not always doing everything that you want, but something that is good. Good and evil came from slave morality. The slave idea of morality is just self-fulfilling. Master and slave morality is like the animal kingdom. Nietzsche wants us to go beyond good and evil. I think that that's fairly obvious with his idea of slave and master morality. I don't think he 100% believes this, but he wants us to harken back to the old days and say, look at how we perceived morality then. It was much easier, not only easier, but makes more sense to our instincts. Unlikely we'll ever see the return of the master and slave idea. Revenge equals justice to Nietzsche, and guilt and sin equals slave morality. Obviously, Christianity wants to keep you in a state of constant guilt, so this is something that he wants to point out. With the master and the slave, Nietzsche is trying to free the slaves and the ones that get into the passions. One of the quotes is, "Why can't justice open our eyes?" This is a common idea in justice, that justice is blind, and we have many statues about that. But sometimes justice can't really be blind. Sometimes we need to look things through the eye. There is no justice in the objective sense. Justice/forgiving is 2 things. 1 is getting over it, and 2 is revenge in the overall emotional sense. So it is not blind. The idea of points of power was popular in science at the time, hence why the one of his books is called Will to Power. Gotcha. Nietzsche dislikes the idea of metaphysics. I don't like metaphysics either. Maybe I'll go over it one day, but it's like things that are beyond physics. So it's not really real in the sense like physics is. It's just meta version of that. So will to power basically means that it's on your way towards the good person or the master morality. Do what you love and money will follow. Goal setting in life is too forceful and reaching for a deadline and not thinking about your actions. These are things that he wants you to take away from reading his literature. Ruled by the best of morality is to be the best. Time isn't a line, but a circle. Most people hate this idea, but I can see why Nietzsche uses it. Nietzsche thinks of his books as him living on endlessly, meaningful in the greater sense. Following with a style gives shape to yourself. So yeah, that was Nietzsche based or cringe. Honestly, I'm thinking he's pretty based. I do like his disses against Christianity, and I thought his points were valid. I really liked his idea of master and slave morality. When I tell other people about it, they think of the worst thing imaginable. They freak out, but like they don't understand the not complexity of it, but the context behind its use. But I don't know. Nietzsche always, I think he's not trying to justify anything that he sees, or morality in general. I think he's just trying to say, hey, look, this is what morality is. We don't know how it works. Don't know how it works at all. We might get close or think that we might have it, but in the end, it's a fleeting game, and we shouldn't be devoted to it. And that's the idea that I think most people come away with. So, was Nietzsche cringe or based? Well, putting his history together, putting his ideas together, I think he's absolutely 100% based. And I think he's better than the Stoics in this way, because his ideas lasted better into the test of time. Nietzsche is probably one of the biggest philosophers, so I think he's done an insanely good job.